Have you ever wandered so far off the beaten path that you wondered if you'd ever find your way back? That unsettling feeling when the world around you is so isolated, so eerily quiet, that you start to question if you're really alone. Every shadow stretches a little too long, every sound takes on a life of its own, and suddenly the vast emptiness isn't just empty, it's alive, watching, waiting. Today, I'm taking you deep into the heart of nowhere, where 3 terrifying tales of the unknown will leave you questioning what's really out there. These aren't just stories, they're warnings from the dark corners of our world, where reality twists into nightmare.
A few years back, my friends and I decided to take a road trip across the country. We were all about adventure, so instead of sticking to the usual tourist spots, we took the back roads, eager to discover hidden gems. On the 3rd night, after hours of driving through desolate stretches of highway, we stumbled upon a small, seemingly forgotten town. It wasn't on any of our maps, and there was no cell service to speak of. As dusk approached, we realized we needed a place to crash for the night. After driving through the empty streets, we finally found what appeared to be an old cabin on the outskirts of town. It looked run down, with peeling paint and a sagging roof, but the lights were on, and there was smoke coming from the chimney. We figured it was better than sleeping in the car, so we pulled up and knocked on the door. An elderly woman answered, her eyes sharp despite her frail appearance. She welcomed us in with a warm smile, saying she rarely got visitors and was happy for the company. The inside of the cabin was surprisingly cozy, with a roaring fire and the smell of something delicious cooking in the kitchen. She insisted we stay the night, even offering us dinner. We were hesitant at first, but her hospitality won us over. After dinner, we settled into the small guest room she had prepared for us. It wasn't long before exhaustion took over, and we fell into a deep sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise, like a low, guttural whispering coming from just outside the window. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the more I listened, the more distinct the voices became. It sounded like multiple people were whispering, their voices overlapping in a language I couldn't understand. I woke my friends, and we all listened in terrified silence. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. We tried to convince ourselves it was just our imagination, but the uneasy feeling lingered. None of us could sleep after that, so we decided to leave as soon as dawn broke. When the first light of morning finally crept through the curtains, we quickly gathered our things and made our way out to the car. But when we stepped outside, something wasn't right. The once cozy cabin looked abandoned, with no signs of life. The windows were shattered, the door was hanging off its hinges, and the chimney was crumbling. It was as if the place had been deserted for decades. Shaken, we got into the car and drove away as fast as we could. We didn't stop until we were miles away from that town. To this day, we have no idea what happened that night, or if the cabin we stayed in even existed at all. But I'll never forget the feeling of those whispers, echoing in my mind, like a warning from whatever dark presence haunted that place in the middle of nowhere. A couple of summers ago, I was visiting a friend who had just moved to a rural area in the Midwest. It was one of those places where the nearest neighbor was miles away, and the night sky was so dark you could see every star. I was excited for a weekend of peace and quiet, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. But what I got was something far more disturbing. One evening, my friend suggested we take a walk through the fields surrounding his property. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the rolling hills. As we walked, we talked about everything and nothing, enjoying the simplicity of the moment. But as night began to fall, a dense fog rolled in, swallowing the landscape in a thick, white blanket. We were about to head back when we saw it. A farmhouse, barely visible through the fog, sitting at the edge of a wooded area. My friend looked puzzled. He'd explored the area extensively since moving in, and swore there was no farmhouse nearby. Curiosity piqued, we decided to check it out. As we approached, the farmhouse came into clearer view. It was old, with weathered wooden boards and broken windows. The front door hung slightly ajar, creaking eerily in the wind. The place looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades, but something about it felt off. There was no sound, no crickets, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, oppressive silence. We hesitated at the door, but in that unspoken way that friends do, we both decided to go inside. The air was stale, filled with the scent of decay and dust. The interior was just as neglected as the exterior. Rotting floorboards, peeling wallpaper, and old furniture covered in cobwebs. But it wasn't the state of disrepair that unsettled us. It was the feeling that something was watching us. We explored the ground floor, finding nothing but the remnants of a life long abandoned. But then we noticed something odd, a staircase leading down to what must have been a basement. The door to the basement was closed, but there were deep, dark stains on the floor, leading from the staircase to the door. Against our better judgment, we opened it. The basement was pitch black, our flashlights barely piercing the darkness. As we descended the stairs, the air grew colder, almost suffocatingly so. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a large, empty room, or at least it seemed empty at first. But then, in the far corner, our flashlights caught something, a pile of old, tattered clothes, and just beyond them, a rusted metal box. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to open it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all black and white, all showing the same farmhouse from different angles. In every photo, the house looked newer, untouched by time. But it was the last photo that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of the farmhouse, but this time there were people in the frame. They were standing in front of the house, staring directly at the camera. And in the background, in one of the upstairs windows, was a shadowy figure, almost indistinguishable from the darkness surrounding it. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from above, like something heavy being dropped. We bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. As we burst through the front door and into the fog, we heard it, a low, guttural growl, reverberating through the still night air. We ran as fast as we could, not stopping until we reached my friend's house. The next morning, we decided to go back and see the farmhouse in daylight. But when we returned to the spot where we had seen it, there was nothing, just an empty field stretching out before us. No house, no sign that one had ever been there. My friend and I never spoke about it again, but sometimes in the dead of night, I can still hear that growl, as if the farmhouse or whatever was inside it never really let us go. A few years ago, I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my mind. I had just gone through a rough patch in life and needed some time alone in nature. I found a spot deep within a national forest, far away from any established campsites. It was the perfect place, isolated, peaceful, and surrounded by nothing but trees for miles. I arrived late in the afternoon, set up my tent, and spent the rest of the evening sitting by a small fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything around me. But I wasn't afraid. In fact, the solitude was comforting, almost therapeutic. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night and crawled into my tent. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it. A faint rustling like something moving through the underbrush. At first, I dismissed it as a deer or some other animal, but the sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't just rustling anymore. There were footsteps, deliberate and heavy, circling my campsite. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a low, creaking sound broke the stillness, like the groan of old wood under pressure. It was an unnatural sound, out of place in the wilderness. My heart raced as I unzipped the tent, just enough to peek outside. In the faint moonlight, I could make out the outline of trees and the glow of the dying embers of my fire. But then, something caught my eye, a structure barely visible through the trees just at the edge of my campsite. I could have sworn it wasn't there before, but in the darkness it was hard to be sure. Curiosity, or maybe foolishness, got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously made my way toward the structure. As I got closer, I realized it was a small, old cabin, weathered by time and the elements. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze, creating that creaking sound I had heard earlier. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but something compelled me to go inside. The interior was just as I expected, dusty, abandoned, with broken furniture and a musty smell that hinted at years of neglect. But what I didn't expect were the drawings. The walls were covered in them, crude sketches scratched into the wood. They depicted twisted faces, contorted in agony, and strange symbols I couldn't decipher. The drawings grew more chaotic, more violent as I moved deeper into the cabin. But what unsettled me the most was the large, roughly carved figure near the back wall. It was a stick figure, but there was something about it that sent chills down my spine. Maybe it was the way its head was disproportionately large, or the fact that it was surrounded by smaller stick figures, all with X's for eyes. As I stood there, staring at the figure, I heard something. A faint whisper, almost too soft to catch. It sounded like my name, but distorted, as if spoken through layers of static. I turned around quickly, shining my flashlight across the room, but saw nothing. The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. My nerves were on edge, and I knew I needed to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut, with a force that rattled the entire cabin. The whispering grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, all speaking in unison, saying the same thing over and over. Leave now, before it's too late. Panic set in as I rushed to the door, struggling to get it open. When I finally did, the voices stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that was almost deafening. I ran back to my campsite, grabbed my gear, and fled into the night, not stopping until I reached my car. I drove straight home, my heart pounding, my mind racing with what had just happened. The next day, I convinced myself it was all a bad dream, that I had let my imagination get the better of me. But a week later, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the pocket of my jacket, the same one I had worn that night, was a small piece of paper, crumpled and old. On it was a single, crudely drawn stick figure with a large head and hollow eyes. There was no way it could have been there before, no explanation for how it got into my pocket. But it was there, a chilling reminder of the cabin in the woods and the voices that warned me to leave.